the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see.
By nature, every successful Underground Railroad journey was extraordinary. But the stories of two freedom seekers who would travel to Canada in separate years and from disparate locations, then meet and marry in Sandwich, are of particular interest. Caroline Quarlls was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1826 and arrived in Sandwich in 1843. Alan Watkins is believed to have been born in Kentucky in 1811. He arrived in Sandwich in 1838. In their new home, they forged lives as free people and established one of Sandwich's most iconic families.
I know that she was very young when she escaped, still a teenager, I think, maybe 16 or 17.
Born in slavery, Caroline Quarlls was the child of an enslaved Black woman named Maria. Her biological father was a white slave owner from a prominent family. By virtue of her mother's status, Caroline at birth automatically became the property of her father's family. As she grew up, Caroline dreamed of achieving freedom. Eventually, in 1843, she made the courageous decision to set off for Canada on her own, a daunting proposition for a 16-year-old girl traveling unaccompanied.
Caroline Quarlls, she became Caroline Quarlls Watkins, was 16 years old in 1843. She was born in 1826 in St. Louis, Missouri. So she was born of a family as the daughter of Maria, who was enslaved by the Quarlls family in Virginia, and a member of the Quarlls household, one of the sons. His name was Robert Pryor Quarlls. Carolyn was born in St. Louis as the granddaughter of her owner, Robert Quarlls, Dr. Robert Quarlls, Revolutionary War hero. She was kept as a housemaid and was, at the time of her escape in 1843, the actual handmaid of her paternal aunt, who was Louisa Ann Quarlls, who became Louisa Ann Quarlls Hall. In 1843, when she escaped, she was owned by a gentleman by the name of Charles Hall, who would have been her paternal uncle by marriage. So she chose the 4th of July, 1843. There were many enslaved that used holidays, in particular the 4th of July, to escape. Why that date? Because generally speaking, people were celebrating. It was the 4th of July, celebrating our freedom, supposedly, for some. And you weren't watched as much. In her case, there were a couple other reasons. Number one, it was a statement. She came from a family that was tied to the Revolutionary War, extremely tied to the Revolutionary War. And that would have been a statement to say, you are celebrating freedoms, but me, a daughter of the house, a cousin, a niece, a daughter, can't. She decided on the 4th of July to hide some things, a dress that she could put on as disguise. She had been taught how to make lace, which a lot of those enslaved had trades. Hers was to make lace, which was a big deal at the time. And she had somehow acquired about $100 that she had saved. And she was given some jewelry by her grandmother. And while the rest of the family was off, she decided just to walk down to the Mississippi and catch a steamer, catch a ferry boat. And she literally bought a ticket on a ferry boat that was going across the river to Illinois first landing was Alton, Illinois. She ended up in Galena, which is further up the river, because they felt it necessary to get her off the Alton dock. Alton was a very high anti-slavery, bounty hunters, everybody landed there because it was the first place across the Mississippi from St. Louis. So she ended up going to Galena on another steamboat up the river, and then got a stagecoach with the help of someone on the dock who was a former freedom seeker who saw her and said, "She's going somewhere. And she's not one of them, she's one of us." Helped her get a ticket to Milwaukee, and our journey began.
Caroline's journey took her from Missouri to Illinois to Wisconsin, then on to Indiana and Michigan, and ultimately to Sandwich, Upper Canada, chased nearly the entire way by men intent on recapturing her, including a steamship captain who had unwittingly sold her a ticket and who was now liable for her market value, $800.
I don't think she knew how to go where she was going, but she was fortunate to run into the right people. Of course, at one point in her journey, she was almost turned in, but she was able to escape that.
Took her till October of 1843, at which point she was literally chased from the city of Milwaukee to the city of Detroit, across 5 states, many boundaries.
To this day, Caroline is lauded as the first freedom seeker ever to have escaped slavery through Wisconsin's Underground Railroad network. Along her journey, Caroline was eventually assisted by various Underground Railroad operatives, most notably Lyman Goodnow, a Milwaukee abolitionist who accompanied her by wagon on the long trip from Wisconsin to Michigan.
She was in many places. One of the last was on the banks of the Huron River. At 1425, it still is. Pontiac Lake Road, which was the home of a gentleman by the name of Guy Beckley, who was the editor-in-chief of the Signal of Liberty, which was an abolitionist newspaper. From there, the day trip took her to Detroit, and she was expected and helped by way of $12 shillings at the time, with a man with a rowboat who we know very well as Mr. William Lambert, who was one of the founding members of Detroit's Anti-Slavery Society, the Vigilant Committee. He was quite a man, freeborn, tailor, and he rowed her in his rowboat. She landed somewhere along here.
Caroline Quarlls crossed the Detroit River to freedom, still pursued by slave catchers, and landed at Sandwich. There, she learned to read and write, and eventually met another formerly enslaved person, Alan Watkins, a freedom seeker from Kentucky. Like many other self-emancipated individuals, Alan was motivated by the desire to keep his family intact. But unlike many others, his Underground Railroad journey had begun amid tragic circumstances, the death of his wife.
In a year, she met a man, a little bit older. His name was Alan Watkins. Alan Watkins was originally born in Richmond, Virginia. He was part of a estate sale and ended up on the banks of the Ohio River in Kentucky, owned by a woman by the name of Nancy Cleveland. It was there that he married, as we would call it today, a woman who was also enslaved. And she bore him 3 children, 3 boys. That union was disrupted because they decided to sell his wife to settle the debts of the estate. She committed suicide, and she jumped into the Mississippi and killed herself, which left Alan with 3 children under the age of 10. Alan was told by his minister of the small church that he attended in Kentucky that he was next, because they needed to acquire money to pay this estate bill off. And Alan's thought was, I've got 3 kids and I cannot leave them alone. They are too young to fend for themselves. So he made a conscious decision in the mid-1830s to flee for his children's life. And he left Kentucky, crossed the Ohio, chased. He stole a buggy and a horse and put his youngest kid into a steamer trunk. And again, this is normal. This was how kids were transported during those days. You're trying to keep them quiet. And the word was used, anesthetized. Probably gave him a little liquor and knocked them out. Put them in a steamer trunk. That's the way they transported the kids, because that way the kids wouldn't cry, they wouldn't yell, and they wouldn't get tired because they couldn't walk. And he started his trek 600 miles, crossing the Ohio.
Alan and his small children made their way to Canada from Kentucky in 1838. A trunk he used to transport the children to freedom remains part of the permanent collection at the Amherstburg Freedom Museum.
He describes hiding under double-layered, double-level bridges in water up to his knees while they're running. People are running over top of the bridge looking for him. And he did it by himself. Carolyn had help on her journey. He did not. It took him several months to get to Colchester. He crossed Lake Erie, using the Sandusky route.
Alan found work in Sandwich as a cook at the home of Colonel John Prince.
Carolyn was 16, going on 17 at the time. He was 28 with 3 kids. But on November the 22nd, 1844, at Second Baptist Church in Detroit by Reverend William Monroe, actually witnessed by Mary, wife, Monroe, they were married and said their I do's and rode back across the river, and life for the Watkins family began.
Alan and Caroline were married in 1844 and were instrumental in the building of the Sandwich First Baptist Church, which they attended for many years. They built a home just a few doors down from the church. Gradually, their children and other Watkins family members would establish homes in close proximity.
The Watkins family, the original homestead of both Carolyn and Alan, is literally next door.
Numerous Watkins descendants remain in Sandwich, Windsor, Detroit, and nearby communities, including some who continue to live in the footprint of the original family homestead on Lott Street, now officially renamed Watkins Street, Windsor's only thoroughfare named after a family of African descent.
And the fact that she could write a letter back to Lyman Goodenough and explain to him her journey and what she was doing in Canada is just amazing that this link was preserved in this particular document, because so much of what happened in the Underground Railroad is not documented. So I think that is spectacular that her rescuer and she were able to communicate many, many decades after that escape took place.
Many freedom seekers made their way to Sandwich, but few Underground Railroad narratives are as well documented as Caroline's and Alan's. Their correspondence with Lyman Goodenough in 1880, many years after their respective journeys to freedom, have safeguarded their stories for all time. The original letters can be found today at the Civil War Museum in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Thanks to these records, along with oral traditions passed down by generations of Watkins family descendants, the remarkable Underground Railroad journeys of both Alan Watkins and Caroline Quarlls will never be forgotten.
How precious did that great face appear. The hour I first believed. My chains are gone, I've been set free. My God, my Savior, has ransomed me. And like a flood, His mercy reigns unending.